the Sci-Fi Christians Game of Thrones coverage. So this time we're talking about House of the Dragon. If you're new with us, this is not the usual setup. I'm actually on vacation today in Myrtle Beach. So for those of you who followed along for the original run of the show, my partner in crime, Ben Kirkhold, will be back with us in a couple of weeks. He should be on vacation, like I said, this week. Next week, I'm getting back very late, so I'll be solo again. But he'll be joining us shortly thereafter. I'm actually here in beautiful Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I'm staying at an Airbnb. If you do hear my neighbors in the background, nothing I can do about that. They have not been quiet to date. It's almost 12 o'clock here, so hopefully that will ease up. But that's my problem, not yours. All right, so we're going to talk about House of the Dragon, Episode 1, The Heirs of the Dragon. But I kind of want to start by rewinding a bit because it's been 3 years since the end of Game of Thrones, and I can't remember another pop culture thing where the legacy of a show or a movie or something has been quite this tumultuous. So Game of Thrones starts. A lot of us are fans of the books. I've read all the books, including the book that House of the Dragon is based off of, Fire and Blood. We'll talk about that more in a second. And I think that when, Game of Thrones first started, knowing HBO's history was kind of these high-budget shows, specifically Rome and Deadwood, both of which were canceled prematurely, there was kind of some trepidation around, is this show going to find enough of an audience to run for at least a while? I remember Benioff and Wise saying early on, I think at one of the early Comic Cons, that they were hoping to get to the Red Wedding, and that would be, a job well done. Maybe that was what went wrong later, where they didn't really know quite what to do after that. But it goes from that, this kind of trepidation of, are we going to get to see more than a season or two? It's becoming maybe the biggest pop culture thing out there. I mean, everybody knew Game of Thrones, including people who didn't watch it. It's just so much in the cultural zeitgeist. And then you have the last couple of seasons that were, at the very least, lesser quality than the others. I didn't hate them nearly as much as other people did, but a lot of people just rejected the show, and then the show ends and it just dies. Like, Game of Thrones has not been out there at all, and in fact it's been, almost to the extent it has been out there, it's been synonymous with a show gone wrong, the disappointing ending, all of that. And so then you get House of the Dragon coming on. It's like, well, how is this going to be received? And I think that's going to be an interesting question. Are audiences willing to come back to it? I think the general population probably will be, but what about those hardcore Game of Thrones fans? I think there's one of the various Game of Thrones subreddits out there that just hates the show. I don't remember off the top of my head which one it is, but it's essentially no longer a fan Reddit, it's a hate Reddit. So that's kind of a little bit different from, certainly where the show was prior to, I would say, season 6 or so. I hope this show is successful. Having read Fire and Blood, which is the source material, there's a lot of good stuff in store. One of the things that is nice about this, maybe double-edged a bit, is if you compare Game of Thrones to Fire and Blood is actually complete, at least up through the point where this series will run. So if you're not familiar with it, Fire and Blood, very different from the other books in the series. It's not a novel per se, it's a pseudo-history covering the Targaryen dynasty from Aegon the Conqueror, which takes place 100 years before this show begins, up through roughly where this show presumably would end. George R. R. Martin's allegedly going to do another volume. We all know how that goes. That would cover the Targaryen dynasty from that point up through where Game of Thrones starts, or rather Song of Ice and Fire for the books. We'll see if that ever happens. But big fan of Fire and Blood. It's spectacular. Highly recommend it if you kind of need that Song of Ice and Fire itch. Is it annoying that we got that instead of Winds of Winter? Yeah, but once you get over that, and I admit that's a lot to get over, but once you get over that, it's pretty spectacular. Now, the downside to that is that this isn't a novel, so the source material is in a pseudo history type of thing, much scantier than is, say, the richness of even 5 books up to that, the point where the Song of Ice and Fire series ends. So one of the dangers I could see from the show from adapting the source material is how different is what they have in Fire and Blood compared to the notes that George R. R. Martin gave Benioff and Wise, um, up around the point where they ran out of source material, and we all know that that didn't go as well as planned. I'm going to be optimistic. I still love the show. I love the original series. I love the book series, even if it never gets finished. Which, boy, is that depressing. I mean, I'm not going to bemoan that because plenty of people have talked about that. But 11 years, the last volume of A Song of Ice and Fire was published, I think, right at the end of season 1 of Game of Thrones. So it's been a long, long time, and we're still waiting. But nevertheless, for all the frustrations that surround the series, we have this new series, we have this new show, and based on episode 1, the potential is here for it to be really, really spectacular. I really like this first episode. One of the things I liked about it is, I think, a common criticism of the last couple seasons of Game of Thrones is that it was moving at this breakneck pace. Okay, this episode shows you that House of the Dragon, at least so far, is not doing that. It takes its time. If you've read Fire and Blood, and I'm not going to give any spoilers away, what we're seeing right now is 100% prologue to what's going to come. And that should be fairly obvious based on some of the things that are being set up. We have the Great Council, which we'll talk about in a second. We have the allusions to, the Rhaenyra being made the heir at the end of the episode, but there's never been a queen, and the Great Council decided against a queen. Then you have Daemon and all of this. So you've got the setup for a lot that's going to come. But what I liked about this episode a lot is that it reminded me of the way classic Game of Thrones would do those early episodes. You didn't get the Red Wedding in episode 1. You didn't get Ned Stark being executed. And by the way, I'm going to presume that you've seen Game of Thrones, or at least familiar enough with it to not care about spoilers. So I will spoil all of Game of Thrones, and I will spoil up through the material that's been covered in Fire and Blood, but I won't spoil anything else that's going to come after that. So anyway, the show started in those early seasons slower, not slow, not plodding, but definitely taking its time. And I think that was reflected here. It's a new cast of characters, which I think is probably going to throw some viewers. It honestly threw me a little bit. It's like we're just so used to, when we're in this world now, we know everybody, and you kind of forget how complicated it is or was when you first started watching Game of Thrones, especially if you weren't a book reader. It's like, we got Starks and Lannisters and blah, blah, blah. Here, not only do we have a new cast of characters, but outside of House Targaryen, not a lot of the familiar faces. There wasn't a Lannister in sight tonight from what I saw. I think at the very end, when they're all pledging their loyalty to Rhaenyra and to Viserys, you do get the head of House Stark. I'm forgetting his name at the moment, but he was there at the very end. But it's like a 2-second shot, so that's all you get of the Starks. And I don't think they're going to play too major of a role in this series. Of course, you have the Targaryens, you have other minor houses. We have the Hightowers, who are major players at the moment. Otto Hightower being the Hand of the King. Viserys' wife is an Arryn, from crazy breastfeeding lady from the original show, Lysa Arryn. I don't think they mentioned her house in the episode tonight, or if they did, I missed it, but that's who she is. It kind of threw me a little bit that they had her in the Targaryen-esque wig because, as we all know, Targaryens into the whole incest thing, and so I wouldn't be surprised if quite a few viewers came away from this tonight thinking she was a Targaryen, but she's not. Uh, so you have some of those minor houses running around. We have familiar people, but beyond that, it's really a new cast of characters. So a little bit of setup, if you're not familiar with Fire and Blood and some of the backstory. This show takes place 100 years after Aegon Targaryen's the Targaryen conquest. So Aegon comes over from the Targaryens are over on Dragonstone, which is where Stannis Baratheon was in the original show. They invade the mainland, they conquer it. Aegon dies, his brother takes over, Maegor the Cruel, who was a crazy, crazy, crazy king, very, tyrannical. There was a couple references to him tonight. If you want more of that, the source material's there. The guy was nuts. I think there's some references to him in the original series as well. And then you have this long reign of Jaehaerys, who is the old king, the guy who's at the very beginning when they do the council. And a lot of Fire and Blood actually takes place with his reign. And if you're interested in some Game of Thrones, Westeros material that's a little bit outside the norm, it's actually kind of interesting because it's really well written in the book. But his reign is not, backstabbing and betrayals and all of that we get in the main series. It's much different than that. And so it kind of has a more peaceful feel to it. I mean, there's drama and everything, but it's more smaller scale drama. So he's referred to as the old king at the time this starts. And we get this great council because he realizes, when I die, he doesn't have a clear heir. Not going to get into all the political family intricacies of that. So he calls all the lords of Westeros together to vote on it. And they wind up going with Viserys as opposed to, I'm forgetting her name, it's another R name. George R. Martin and his R names, holy crap. If you played Elden Ring, which he did, and I love Elden Ring, so huge shout out for Elden Ring. If you haven't played it, do. It's one of the best games I've ever played. But George R. R. Martin wrote the lore for it, and if you've played the game, all the gods in it are named with either a G, R, or an M, which is kind of amusing, but also makes them extremely confusing, and I'm having the exact same problem with the characters in this one, so I'm not going to try and remember what's her name, but it's the queen who never was. So they go with Viserys, and so you have this council, and this is one of the things that impressed me right off the bat with the series, and kind of amused me at the same time, because, like I said, I didn't hate the last 2 seasons of Game of Thrones, but one thing I did hate, I absolutely hated that council they had at the end where they chose Bran. Not because they chose Bran, but because we've watched 8 seasons of these people killing each other for the throne, and it comes down to half dozen people in a tent deciding to give it to Bran. And Tyrion's just up there like, oh, wouldn't this be a great story? I don't know. I haven't watched it in a long time, so I'm getting some of the details wrong, but it's utter crap. It's just a complete cop out, and it's totally unbelievable that any of these people who have been, doing all these horrible things to each other and to the realm for the last 8 seasons are going to go with that. And then in the opening seconds of this show, you get the Great Council, and instantly it's a different feel. Like, this is big, this is spectacular, this is what a Westerosi council feels like. There's politics and backstabbing, and not everybody's happy, whereas at the end of Game of Thrones, everyone's just like, well, I guess it's Bran now, we're gonna go with Bran. Total bullshit. This was fantastic, though, so I really liked the way that they did the Great Council. I'm glad we didn't linger there too much. I thought the show did a good job of kind of getting the point across. And moving on, and then you have this jump forward where, okay, Jaehaerys was successful. You have 9 years of peace, and now things are beginning to be turbulent again. The one thing that's said in the opening of the Great Council is that if the Targaryens are going to fall as a house, it's going to be from within. I'm sure I'm getting the wording wrong a little bit. And on the one hand, we know that doesn't happen because we know from Game of Thrones, which has about 200 years, a little bit less. I think they said 174 in the title card to when Daenerys was born. So you got a couple hundred more years of the Targaryen dynasty to go. But one of the other things you'll notice is that we've got tons of dragons here. I think they said 10 in the opening prologue. And in Game of Thrones, we have no dragons until Daenerys hatches her 3. So something happens, and eventually, of course, the Targaryens are overthrown. Now, everything that happens from this story we're getting now to when Daenerys is born is still very unclear because George R. R. Martin hasn't, and let's be honest, probably will not write that second book in the Fire and Blood history. But nevertheless, the implication that the show is going after, and is in the source material as well, is that the beginning of the end is here. It's what we're now going to witness over the events of the show. So lots of good stuff in store. Like I mentioned, this first episode really is prologue. I believe that the 2 actresses who play Rhaenyra, who's the daughter of Viserys, and Alicent Hightower, who's the daughter of the Hand of the King, who goes and kind of seduces him with a book. Well, he's got that, kick-ass model that he's building. That was spectacular. I think they're actually going to be replaced later on in the season, so we can expect a time jump. If you look in the cast, there's actresses for the older and younger version, and I believe this was the younger versions that we were seeing today. So lots of stuff in store for that. Just, a few other things here. I'm not going to do kind of the typical go through the notes because I'll be honest, I didn't take notes through this, so it's a bit more off the top of my head than we usually do. We'll be back to normal with how we've done these videos in the relatively near future. But a couple of things that stood out to me in this episode. Number one is that even though there is sort of the blood and sex and all the stuff that Game of Thrones is known for, it's a lot tamer than it used to be. And I think that's almost a carryover from the last couple seasons of Game of Thrones, where things sort of became a bit more sanitized. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's fine. I was actually reading that after South Park made fun of them, they got a little bit self-conscious and started to pull back on some of the more extreme R-rated elements. And of course, you've had the Me Too movement and everything in the last number of years, and so I think that's all pulled the reins a little bit. But it did amuse me just a little bit in being out of character in the scene where Damon is having sex with the prostitute, and they're kind of doing the Austin Powers block everything as they're walking around, and even the scenes like where Damon takes the King's Watch out and he kills everybody, all the criminals, and he's chopping off limbs and everything. It's gory, but this isn't classic Game of Thrones gory. So it'll be interesting to see how that holds up. I think it's fine either way. I don't want the show to feel sanitized, but we don't necessarily need the sex position stuff that the early seasons became famous for. In terms of characters, I think right away, Damon is going to be a fan favorite. They're really setting him up as the villain in this series. Matt Smith is spectacular, but he's going to be the type of villain where exactly who you want in Game of Thrones. He's going to be that charismatic villain, the one that we're, maybe at times rooting for, even though maybe we shouldn't. Matt Smith does a really good job in this. I think most of us probably know him from Doctor Who. Very different character from the Doctor. In this one, and when I first saw he was being cast as Damon, I was curious how that was going to go. I'm not familiar with Matt Smith and a lot of other stuff. I'm sure I've seen him in something else, but Doctor Who, of course, it stands out. So kind of a cast against type, at least from that perspective. He did a really good job, and I think he's going to carry it through. The other character who didn't get a ton in this episode, but the Sea Snake, who's the black guy with the golden hair, from what I know of the source material, and even the little bits we got, I think he's really going to be a standout character as well. These are the people who we're going to see more wheeling and dealing. I think we can expect Damon to be a bit more of the blunt, less subtle, type of character go out there and kill everybody, whereas the sea snake is much more of the political animal that, and hey, for Game of Thrones, we want both. So excited to see what happens with them. I will say, going back to the brutality a second, violence aside in the tournament or any of those other scenes, holy crap, the C-section scene, that was as tough to watch and as brutal as anything that I've seen on Game of Thrones. C-sections in medieval times, not a good time. Obviously, this isn't literally medieval times, but it's an analog, so close enough. But boy, oh boy, that was rough to watch. And Viserys, I'm not familiar with the actor who plays him, but really, really well done, where he has to make this horrible choice between his wife and his son, and then he winds up losing them both. And the moment where they're strapping her down, and she's realizing what's about to happen, he's holding her hand. It's just like, holy crap! And I think what's so great about that performance, Paddy Constantine, I think is his name, is that the actor who plays Viserys is, and I hope he's Viserys. It's another V name. Gosh, all these Targaryens were just, all those names get terribly confusing. But he does such a good job in that moment, and he comes across as a genuinely good man, which is not something we're used to seeing in the ruling class of Game of Thrones. So he's genuinely a good king. He makes a horrible choice, maybe a necessary one. You can debate that. Maybe the right one, maybe the wrong one. I think that they kind of implied that his wife was dying either way, but even so, just brutal, brutal, brutal. But the other thing you'll note with his character in this episode is that he is cut at least twice by the Iron Throne. Once we see, and then once is implied when they're treating that gross wound on his ass. That one scene, medicine in Westeros is not a pleasant thing. And if you know anything about Game of Thrones lore, if you're cut on the Iron Throne, it means the Iron Throne has rejected you. So we'll let that play out in due course. But really, really good stuff there. So we're set up for an interesting season. I'm going to be excited to see where this goes. Again, I have read the source material, but it's hard to say how much they're going to be covering. It's hard to say how many seasons this is planning on running. When I originally heard they were doing a prequel show, I was, having read Fire and Blood, was envisioning maybe more of an anthology type thing, starting with Aegon's conquest and then moving forward, and then you'd get to this, and this could be maybe a couple seasons. So you could condense it and do it very, very fast, or you could probably more likely have it run for 4 or 5 seasons. I don't see this going all 8 seasons like the original was, but given that ran out of steam, maybe that's for the best. 4 seasons I see in the comments there. Okay, that would make sense. The other thing I've heard was reading is that there's a rumor that David Tennant's son, speaking of Doctor Who connections, is going to be playing Aegon the Conqueror in flashbacks. So that would be pretty great if we got to see some of that. There's so much material in Fire and Blood that it would be a shame if we only saw this tiny little slice of it. So I'm fingers crossed for that one. All right, I don't know how much more I have to say on this. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope this show does get an audience. Duncan Egg would be great to see. That would be fantastic. Those are, if you're not familiar with the Duncan Egg novellas, there. I think there's 3 or 4 of them right now, and of course, as usual, George is promising more on the way eventually, so hold your breath. I'm sure they'll be along any day now. But those are novellas that take place, I think, relatively recently before Song of Ice and Fire. It's within that about a generation before, and those are spectacular. So I'm sure those will get adapted at some point if the franchise continues to be successful. So for those of us who qualms or whatever about Martin not finishing the books, about the last couple seasons, despite all of that, have stayed on as fans of Game of Thrones, it's spectacular to be back in Westeros. I'm excited for what's to come, and that music is still spectacular. I forget it's this I don't know how to pronounce his name. It's R.D. Raymond Dwally, I think it is. I'm just going to go with that. He does the music for Westworld too, and he's spectacular. And man, that Game of Thrones music just takes you right back. So great to be back. Excited to be talking about with you guys this season. Excited to see what's to come. So that's all for tonight. I'm Ben DiBono, and we'll be back next week for more House of the Dragon. Goodbye.